Hello, listeners, and welcome to an emergency episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. I want to thank Iran in particular, but also Israel in their role for this lovely 5th anniversary present for me and my wife. We were out at dinner celebrating our 5th anniversary last night when my phone started blowing up talking about World War III and Iran is attacking Israel and what is Israel going to do in retaliation and the price of oil is going to go to 500 a barrel and all this other nonsense. And my wife said, do you need to work? Do we need to leave dinner? Do we need to go home? And I said, nope. I had half a mind to get home and record this podcast just then to explain why I thought in the short term this was a nothing burger, even though there were some very big implications we need to tease out in a sober way. But I decided to wait until this morning to see how things unfolded, and also because I figured most of you wouldn't be listening to a podcast at 10 p.m. at night, at least those of you in my time zone. So let's talk about what happened. Iran launched a bunch of missiles and a bunch of drones at Israel. Basically, none of them achieved the goal of killing Israelis or striking any Israeli targets in a meaningful sense. Right now, I'm recording Sunday, April 14th, 7:18 a.m. If you have the privilege of looking at this on YouTube, by the way, you will see that I am dressed to go play pickup basketball as soon as I upload this recording, probably much to the chagrin of my producer, but that's neither here nor there. So it's early here in the morning. There was one 7-year-old girl, I believe, was injured in Israel. She happens to be Muslim. And you can see that Israel is playing the PR game by putting out videos of these Iranian missiles and the missile intercepts happening over the Dome of the Rock, over sites that are holy not just to Jews, but also to Muslims, and accusing Iran of even putting those holy sites in jeopardy and things like that. Israel was able to knock out most of the missiles and the drones, but not by itself. Jordan also, which is on the path from Iran to Israel, if you don't have a map in front of you, knocked out some of the Iranian drones and missiles. And the United States, at least according to the White House, pre-positioned naval destroyers and other capabilities there so that they could help the Israelis in shooting down some of the Iranian missiles and some of the Iranian drones. That's the short version. We'll talk about what's going to happen next and the importance in just a second. Now, why did this happen? This we need to go back. I'm not going to give you the whole why is Iran and Israel at each other's throat. There's a whole Persian versus Israelite sort of story to tell there that could span many thousands of years. I'm not even going to go back to October 7th, where Iran was nominally a sponsor of Hamas. I don't think the mastermind behind Hamas's attacks on October 7th, but certainly has armed Hamas and has given Hamas support in recent years, which was a change. Iran didn't always see eye to eye with Hamas, and they're both ethnically, ideologically on different sides of everything. But to understand why this happened, we need to go back to 2 weeks ago on April 1st, when Israel struck a building adjacent to the Iranian embassy. I believe it was an Iranian consulate, and in so doing, killed an Iranian general that was based there, one of a senior commander from Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. I would note at the time, and the Washington Post recorded this at the time, that the United States was very, very frustrated that Israel did not notify them before conducting that strike on an Iranian site in Syria. So Israel didn't tell the United States what it was going to do. And the United States was concerned about that because it has implications for the United States. The United States was worried about retaliations from Iran or from Iranian proxies against U.S. installations or U.S. troops that are in different places all around the region. We saw this just a couple of months ago when U.S. soldiers died in Jordan when an Iranian proxy, Kataib al-Hezbollah, struck U.S. targets and quickly went back from it. One of the reasons I point that out is because Iran told everyone what they were doing. They have been saying for days that they were going to retaliate for this attack on the consulate and the assassination of this general. I would have been much more concerned if Iran had done this as a surprise maneuver. Instead, Iran told the United States far enough ahead of time so that the United States could pre-position naval destroyers and other capacities so that they could pick off some of these missiles. Some of these missiles. Israel has been saying for days that they expected an Iranian attack and warning Israelis to be on guard, to get ready to go to the bomb shelters, all these other things. They were telling every single country in the region what they were going to do. That's telling me that Iran does not want escalation. Doesn't mean that they won't respond if Israel takes up the baton here. But what Iran wants was really just to say, okay, you can't just assassinate our generals and we're not going to do anything. That's not going to work anymore. So if you assassinate our people in Syria, you are going to feel the effects at home. We are going to strike you directly. That's not something we're just going to leave to our proxies. But by the way, we don't want this to spiral out of control. United States, we don't want to start a World War III. We're not mining the Straits of Hormuz, all these other things. I think that's a really important point because if you look at the initial reaction to this last night, it's already sobered up a little bit. But I mean, I saw even well respected accounts that I follow on Twitter or some of the initial news reports from major media reports talking about Iran closing the Straits of Hormuz and could that closure of 22% of oil trade coming out of the Strait of Hormuz lead to a World War III type scenario, or even to a increase of the price of crude up to 500 a barrel to 1,000 a barrel. I mean, these are crazy, demented thoughts. Like none of that was in the cards, and Iran has been clearly showing here that it's not that interested in escalation. I want to say something about Iran's capacity because I don't think this was a failure for Iran, which is how the Western media, how the United States, how Israel is trying to play this up. I do, however, think that it shows us some things about the limits on Iranian power, the constraints on Iranian power, and really the constraints in how Iran and Israel can wage war on each other. Again, if you don't have a map in front of you, I'll say this to you, but it's worthwhile to get a map out in front of you. Israel and Iran are very far away from each other. It is not easy for these countries to strike at each other. A land conflict, basically unimaginable. You'd have to get through, all the mountains that define Iran. You'd have to get through Iraq, have to get through Jordan, the West Bank, even for, somewhere these land forces would have to meet, or if Iran was invading, like that's the land that they would have to traverse to get there. So a land conflict is basically out of it. An air conflict is also basically out of it. Neither side really has air assets that can field a full complement of weaponry and a fuel tank big enough to go bomb sites in that part of the world and then come back and make it home. Um, One of the reasons I've always been skeptical that Israel was going to go after Iran or bomb nuclear sites and things like that directly was because they just don't have the bases or the refueling capacity in the air to do that sorts of thing. That's why that's why I'm always watching for, is Israel going to have basing rights in a place like Azerbaijan? Is Israel trying to develop some kind of capability for refueling in the air? Vice versa for Iran. Iran actually has proxies that are much closer to Israel. Maybe they could station some of that equipment there, although Israel would probably blow it up as soon as it got there. My point being, these are pot shot missiles and drones. This is the best that Iran can muster. Also, just note that as soon as you get out of Iranian airspace, Iran starts to encounter the limits of its own soft power because the Sunni Arab world doesn't like Iran and wants nothing to do with Iran. In fact, doesn't like Iran more than it hates Israel for the most part. Countries like Jordan, like Egypt, like Saudi Arabia, they pay lip service to the Palestinian cause. They don't do anything for the Palestinians. They don't care about the Palestinians. They never have. They've always hung the Palestinians out to dry. It's one of the reasons I feel so badly for the Palestinians because everybody, even their purported allies, hangs them out to dry. The point being here, though, that countries like Egypt, like Jordan, now Saudi Arabia today, are pursuing better relations with Israel, even amidst the ongoing war in the Gaza Strip, which gets increasingly more deadly and increasingly more depressing because they are afraid of countries like Iran or even countries like Turkey. And you saw this in Jordan, literally shooting down some of these missiles and drones. Egypt has been, calling for restraint, but spun up their military forces. They were on watch. I have not seen a direct response from Saudi Arabia yet, but I guarantee you that they were watching closely, and they were happy to have the warning from Iran about what it was about to do. So just there are limits to the extent to which Israel and Iran can fight each other. And it's why this fight has always been something of a shadow game. Assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists, Iranian proxies in places like Syria and Lebanon, assassinations of Iranian generals in places like Syria. This is the best way that these two countries can actually go at each other. So there are limits to Iranian power, constraints on Iranian power, also constraints on the extent to which Israel and Iran can actually wage war against each other. And I think nobody talks about that because that's not the sexy thing to say. That's the thing that cuts against this idea that there's going to be some kind of escalation. But that's the truth. If you really want escalation here, you have to bring in other powers. You have to bring in the United States. You have to bring in the Saudis. You have to bring in Turkey. That's the escalatory conflict where things get a little bit scary. Now, I don't think that Iran was particularly successful, obviously, in killing Israelis or in diminishing some kind of Israeli capacity. I doubt that is what Iran was trying to do. I think Iran was trying to probably do a couple different things. I think first and foremost, they wanted to save face. They had to do something. They couldn't continue to take it on their back foot that their generals are getting assassinated in places like this and leaving it to the proxies to attack Israel. Number two, I think they were testing Israel's defense capabilities. So they wanted to see exactly what Israel could do. And I think they launched as many missiles and drones as they did. They probably launched the crappy ones because what they wanted to see was, could Israel's missile defense hang with what the Iranians were going to send? Could they saturate Israel's defenses? They might have learned something of, what if Israel was alone in this? What if we hadn't warned everyone? What if Jordan hadn't lent a helping hand? What if the United States had not prepositioned destroyers and anti-missile capabilities in the region to help Israel fight this off? Could we maybe have saturated their defenses and made a little bit bigger of an impact on what was going on in Israel? They also were able to the extent that the Israeli economy is still going with a full draft and a war going on in the Gaza Strip. I mean, they got everybody in their bunkers. They scared the crap out of everybody. They got the Israeli government, telling everyone to not go to sleep at night because there might be more reprisals and things might happen here. I think also Iran got to test what the response of Israel's allies would be. And I'm not sure if Iran, at least for Iran's own interest, liked the response, but it saw that the United States came to the party. And it saw that Arab states like Jordan, they weren't going to take it lying down, that Iran has more maybe diplomatic work to do there if it's going to knock out some of Israel's allies around it. That said, I can't help but think, is that what Iran wants? If Iran knows that if it attacks Israel, that it's going to lead to some form of U.S. intervention, some sort of focus from the United States, maybe that's an important lesson for Iran to learn, because I don't think Iran is acting just by itself here. It is very useful for Iran to know that it can distract the United States to the point of deploying military capabilities to the region if it fires off a couple pot shots at Israel, even if they're ones that are not going to be that significant. And that, I think, leads into the bigger point here, which is this is good for countries like Russia. It's sort of ambiguously good for a country like China. On the one hand, China doesn't like the volatility in access to Middle East energy supplies, but I think in the long run, China's trying to wean itself off of dependence on Middle East energy supplies, and they have plenty of coal, and I think they're building new nuclear reactors and things like that. It's good if you're an Iranian proxy like the Houthis, who also sent some missiles, and Hezbollah, which also sent some missiles against Israel in this recent worsening of the conflict. What Iran is showing here is that it can soak up the attention of the United States and of Israel and some of these different allies. And remember, Iran is supplying some of these same drones and missiles to Russia in the Ukraine war. Iran has difficult relations with both China and Russia, but has established sort of partnership agreements with both of these countries. I don't think it's because they are deep allies in any meaningful sense of the world, but because Iran likes the idea of a multipolar world where the United States has different conflicts that it's constantly having to worry about. And if Iran knows that, okay, we can flip the switch here and really focus U.S. attention on this region, well, then you're taking attention away from Ukraine. You're taking attention away from Taiwan. You're taking attention away from other geopolitical hotspots, maybe a Venezuela in the future or a Cuba. You're taking attention away from what the United States might need to focus on from a strategic perspective, which is some of these other conflicts, or, God forbid, investing in infrastructure and education and that whole, I won't go on that diatribe right now, but actually focusing as much on making the United States a better place rather than sending all these fancy missiles and things like that abroad. But again, I won't go down that rabbit hole, but you're distracting the United States in that sense. And now you know that that is a capability that you have. I think that is something that is pretty valuable for Iran in the long run. Again, just remember, Iran did not want escalation. It will escalate if Israel decides to go with escalation from here, but I don't think that's what they want. I think they did what they wanted to do. I think they probably learned some interesting things about Israel's defense capabilities. They learned some things about the support of Israel's allies, and they'll use that information going forward. And that sort of brings us to the last thing I want to say, which is to talk about what Israel is doing here. Israel's playing a losing hand. I confess, I don't know what Israel is doing. Maybe Israel's playing three-dimensional chess and I don't understand the strategy, and maybe a top Israeli official, if they bother to listen to this podcast, will come on and set me right and tell me what I'm missing here. But I've said this before and I'll repeat it just because it's still true. The Israel Defense Forces are not built for long-term conflicts or wars of attrition. Israel is a small state. It has a small population. It has a very, very highly skilled, high morale army, but it is not one that Israel can sustain for long periods over time without doing serious damage to the Israeli economy. That is why all of Israel's great military successes have been basically blitzkriegs. The Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, the War of Independence. These were wars that were over very quickly because Israel was able to amass overwhelming strength, defeat their enemies very quickly, and then get back to living and growing and startup nation and all the other things that have made Israel successful over recent decades. Israel's not doing that right now. The war in Gaza has already gone on too long. It started in October. The Israel Defense Forces, the Israeli economy, Israeli society is not built to be militarized for as long as it has been so far. And for what political end? You can't destroy Hamas. Hamas is an idea, and you can't even apparently destroy the senior leaders right now. They're still around, and it's April 14th. What are you trying to do? You haven't even touched Hezbollah yet. There were reports a couple weeks ago that maybe Israel was thinking about going after Hezbollah. How? Failed in the context of the 1980s to eliminate threats in Lebanon during the Lebanese Civil War. You actually probably helped create Hezbollah in that scenario. Failed miserably in the war with Hezbollah in, can't remember now if it was 2006 or 2007, which year it was, but failed miserably in doing anything against Hezbollah in that war. Now picking a long-term fight with Iran, this cost Iran nothing to send these missiles out. It brought Israel to a standstill. And now Israeli strategic planners and decision makers have to think about this. Remember also, it's probably a lot cheaper to build a cheap rocket or a cheap missile or a cheap drone than it is to have these anti-ballistic missile capabilities constantly refreshed. It's analogous to what's going on with the Houthis in the Red Sea right now, who are using very, very cheap weapons to attack shipping and to attack ships in the Red Sea, which the United States can respond to with overwhelming force, but with missiles that cost millions of dollars. So you have this asymmetry here where the Houthis can do this all day. Can the United States afford, to stop them with missiles going at least $1 million a clip? Can Israel afford to spend all of its money on these anti-missile capabilities? And can they even hold up if Iran is able to saturate the missile capabilities? None of these things are perfect. If you've read World War Z, eventually Israel's defenses and capabilities will fail it. They are not invincible. They can't do everything else. So there's a losing strategy there right now. I also have to get a little bit cynical here because it seems to me that the only interest Israel has in these wars continuing to spin is that it means that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu gets to stay in power. The venality of the Netanyahu government, where all the incentives are aligned at keeping the conversation about the war and not about the security failures of the Netanyahu government, the allegations of corruption into Netanyahu's previous rule and probably his current rule right now, the degradation of Israel's society, the break of the social contract, the embrace of far right-wing religious parties that want a very, very different vision of Israel than Israel's founders and certainly than Benjamin Netanyahu's father and brother wanted. I mean, it's very hard not to be cynical about what role Netanyahu is playing in all this. He has also, made a career out of banging the drum about the threat that Iran poses to Israel, that Iran poses an existential threat to Israel. And you've already heard from me, I just don't think that. I think that's nonsense. And if anything, the way that Israel has dealt with Iran just sort of creates that self-fulfilling prophecy. So in some ways, the thing that I'm most unsure about here is, what does Israel do next? Does Israel retaliate in such a way that it forces Iran to escalate? Is that what Israel wants? Does Israel want to drag the United States into a wider conflagration? I don't think that that's necessarily in Israel's interest, but it is certainly in the Netanyahu government's interests. And it's what the Netanyahu government has been pushing for a very long time. And that's not my opinion. We can debate about whether I'm right or not. That, I think, is an objective reading of what the Netanyahu government is doing. Happy to debate if people think that's right or wrong. But to me, that's what the facts look like. Two other sort of parting thoughts. This is something I've also talked about on the podcast, but I think it bears mentioning. Welcome to a world of nuclear proliferation. There's going to be no stopping Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And if Iran is going to get a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia is going to get a nuclear weapon. Probably Turkey's going to get a nuclear weapon. Maybe some of the Gulf states like the UAE will get nuclear weapons. Could Egypt even think about getting a nuclear weapon? Most of these countries, I think, were already set on this path by the Libya invasion. They saw that if Gaddafi had nukes, probably the international coalition wouldn't have gone in and taken him out. But if Iran, on the doorstep of all these different powers, is going to have nukes, I don't think these countries are going to rely on a U.S. security guarantee. I think they're going to pursue nuclear weapons in and of their own right. And I will say, even though I think Israel is the biggest source of uncertainty here in the short term going forward about how they're going to escalate, once Iran does have nuclear weapons, the calculus of this entire relationship starts to change. I had a conversation with D. Smith we're going to put out in just a week and a half, so you'll get sort of a preview of it here from me. But is this the place where nuclear weapons get used for the first time since they were invented in the context of World War II? Could you see a universe in which Iran decides to use those nuclear weapons? Are they only going to be used for defensive purposes? It takes my mind to a very dark place of thought. There are positive effects by that, by the way. I mean, if you're thinking about nuclear industries in some of these countries and the rise of nuclear power, which could be an attendant sort of fallout from that, maybe there's some silver lining to get there. But that's about all I can say. I mean, adding nuclear weapons to a region that has shown that it is as volatile as it is pretty depressing. Um, Last but not least, if you've listened to this podcast for a long time, you already know this. If you're just discovering this because you wanted sober, objective analysis about Iran's attacks, great. Welcome to my worldview. I think we're headed towards a multipolar world, which is to say, I don't think there's going to be one dominant power in the world. I don't think there's going to be two dominant powers in the world. I don't think this is a US-China Cold War. And this is an excellent example of what a multipolar world looks like. China is not pulling the strings with Iran. It may benefit in ancillary ways, but really, if anybody's pulling the strings or if anyone is pushing Iran to do this, it's probably Russia, because Russia could use U.S. distraction from the war in Ukraine. It could use U.S. weapons and things like that being diverted, even just global attention away from what's going on in Ukraine so that they can push the strategy there. Some nice and sort of historical coherence to Russian support of North Korea in the 1950s to what they're doing, I think, with Iran right now. Which is to say, this isn't China and the United States Cold War 2.0. This is its own brush fire in its own region that some of the great powers are involved with and doing their own things in order to realize their own interests. I think it is fascinating that the one country that has been fairly quiet so far, and maybe they will come out with a statement later today, but as I said, I'm recording here before 8 a.m. U.S. Central Time, and I haven't seen the statement yet. Turkey has said nothing. Not only has Turkey said nothing, Turkey bombed a couple Kurdish sites, PKK sites, in Iraq early this morning, while everybody else was freaking out about the Iran-Israeli attack. Now, they've been there for a while. Erdogan announced an increase in Turkish operations there last month, so this is nothing new. But you also, if you go to Turkish papers and media right now, it's still blaming Israel for its invasion of Gaza. Erdogan went so far as to say to Mahmoud Abbas just yesterday that Israel will pay for the crimes that it's committing in the Gaza Strip. But Turkey has not come out and condemned Iran, and that Turkey is a historical enemy of Russia. Turkey is still in NATO. Turkey is still a U.S. ally if you sort of put all the chips down there in general. I'm not sure if things stay that way, but I think Turkey's silence here is very interesting. We'll have to see which direction they go. And this is my parting thought, both for Israeli listeners and any Israeli decision makers that are listening, but also in general. If you're thinking about the future of Israel, the existential threat is not Iran. The first existential threat is the deterioration of Israeli social society. Previous Jewish polities in this part of the world usually collapsed in on themselves before anybody else conquered them. But then your second order existential threat is Turkey, because Turkey is the one that is next door. And Turkey is the one that doesn't like the way that Israel is treating the Sunni Arab Palestinian population. And you can see the angst and the tension that is building between Israel and Turkey as they move in very opposite directions, as both of those societies get more radical, more conservative, more religious, what have you. But here, at least in the short term, Turkey not signing up for Iran, also not condemning them publicly, doing exactly sort of what they did with the Russia-Ukraine war. Not condemning Russia that much, supporting maybe Ukraine a little bit, always trying to play all sides, but they are the interesting story here. And all of this, again, this is what a multipolar world looks like. Different powers, different regions, lots of volatility, disruptions in shipping, disruptions in energy supply. Like that's all of what the multipolar world looks like. And I just say that to remind you that not everything is about US and China. And for Iran, reminding everybody that not everything is about the US and China might have been the goal here all along. Whatever you're doing today, I hope you enjoy yourself, unless you are in the Middle East and directly affected by this conflict, which I'm sorry if you are. Don't worry about World War III happening today. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm not worried about it. I'm going to play pickup basketball. As I say at the end of, or at the beginning of every podcast, I'll end with it. Take care of the people you love. Cheers and see you out there. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.